The morning everything changed, my assistant didn't look up from her computer when I walked past her desk. After 11 years, Maureen had never once missed saying good morning. Not during the merger scare in 2019, not during the pandemic shutdowns, not even the morning after her mother passed and she came in anyway because that was just who she was. That Tuesday in March, she stared at her screen like it was the most important thing in the world, and every instinct I'd spent 30 years building told me exactly what that meant. My name is Walter Finch. I'm 54 years old, and I'd spent the last 3 decades working in commercial real estate development across Ontario. Started as a project coordinator straight out of Ryerson, worked my way up through the brutally competitive Toronto market during the boom years, survived 2 recessions, watched entire firms collapse around me, and somehow came out the other side with the kind of track record that made clients nervous to work with anyone else. I joined Meridian Property Group 15 years ago when it was still a mid-sized firm fighting for contracts against the big boys on Bay Street. What I brought them was simple relationships with municipal planners in Ottawa, with pension fund managers in Calgary, with the kind of institutional investors who didn't return calls from people they didn't know personally. 3 weeks before that Tuesday morning, I'd closed the deal of my career, the Laurentian mixed-use development in downtown Hamilton. A $340 million project that would transform 6 city blocks near the waterfront into a combination of residential towers, commercial space, and a public transit hub connecting to the GO network. Hamilton had been trying to attract this kind of investment for a decade, but been quietly working those relationships for 2.5 years, flying back and forth between Toronto and Hamilton, sitting through City Council presentations, navigating the Heritage Canada review process for 2 heritage-designated buildings on the site, coordinating with Infrastructure Ontario on the transit component. The city's planning department doesn't move fast for anyone. But they moved for me because I'd spent years making sure they trusted Meridian to deliver what we promised. The deal locked in a management fee structure that guaranteed Meridian $4.1 million when the development financing closed, which was scheduled for April 9th, 3 weeks away. My performance bonus tied to that fees was $680,000, vesting on April 10th. I'd told my wife the night before that I was thinking of taking a week off after it cleared, maybe drive up to our place near Parry Sound, watch the ice break on the lake. She'd laughed and said I wouldn't last 2 days without checking my email. She was probably right. Walking through the Meridian offices that Tuesday, I noticed things. Small things that most people wouldn't register, but that 30 years of reading rooms had hardwired into me. The junior associates on the 3rd floor suddenly found their monitors very interesting. My colleague from the Hamilton file, a guy I'd brought into the deal 18 months in to handle the Heritage Canada negotiations, nodded at me without making eye contact. Our receptionist, who normally had opinions about everything including my haircut, pretended to be on a call that I was fairly certain wasn't happening. The meeting invite had come the night before. 9 a.m., Boardroom A. No agenda. Just my name and the names of our CEO, our head of HR, and someone listed as external legal counsel. In commercial real estate, you learn that there are 2 kinds of meetings with external legal counsel, the kind where you're about to do something exciting, and the kind where someone's about to get hurt. The only exciting thing on Meridian's calendar was the Laurentian closing, and that meeting was already scheduled with an entirely different legal team. I didn't rush upstairs, old habit. When you're walking into an ambush, you don't run toward it. I stopped at my office, unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk, and pulled out my employment contract. All 18 pages, including the schedule of amendments I'd negotiated over the years. Most of it was standard corporate language. The kind of thing that reads like it was written by a committee of people who'd never had a real conversation. But buried in Schedule C, Amendment 4, was a paragraph I'd insisted on during my contract renewal 20 months earlier. The clause was specific. If Meridian terminated my employment without documented cause within 60 days of a major transaction closing, where my direct involvement was the determining factor in securing the client, I was entitled to my full bonus plus an additional 50%, plus documented out-of-pocket costs related to the transaction. The phrase determining factor had been argued over for 3 weeks. Our outside counsel had pushed back. I'd held firm. In the end, they'd agreed to the language because the CEO at the time, a man named Richard who actually understood how deals got done, said it was fair. Richard had retired 8 months ago. The new CEO, a woman named Celeste, had come from a private equity background in Vancouver. Smart, fast-moving, genuinely impressive in a lot of ways. But she'd arrived with a mandate to cut overhead, and in her world, experienced people with large compensation packages were overhead. Her son-in-law had started as a strategic consultant to the firm 2 months after she joined. He was 31 years old with a master's in urban planning from UBC and an absolute conviction that data analytics could replace the kind of institutional knowledge that takes decades to build. In meetings, he talked about relationship capital, like it was a line item you could manage from a spreadsheet. I took the stairs to the boardroom. The blinds were drawn. Celeste sat at the head of the table with our HR director and a man in a grey suit I didn't recognize. No laptops, no performance documentation. Nothing on the table except a manila folder in front of the HR director and a set of papers that were clearly already prepared for signing. "Walter," Celeste said, with the particular tone of someone who has rehearsed this conversation. "Thank you for coming in." "Of course," I said, sitting down and taking my time to look at the room. The outside lawyer was a senior partner type, expensive suit, careful eyes. He was watching me, the way people watch something they're not entirely sure is safe to approach. "Maureen looked busy this morning. She doing all right?" Nobody answered that. "Walter," Celeste continued, "as you know, we've been going through a strategic review of our operations. After careful consideration, we've made the decision to restructure the senior development team. We're moving to a more integrated model, and unfortunately that means your position is being eliminated. Effective today." I took a breath, looked at her, then at the lawyer. "Effective today," I repeated. "Can you walk me through the board approval process for this restructuring? When was the decision made?" The lawyer leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Finch, these organizational decisions don't require detailed explanation. They do when the person being restructured holds active client relationships with Infrastructure Ontario and 2 pension fund managers whose participation in $340 million financings is still pending," I said. "Those aren't just my professional relationships. Those are relationships with fiduciary obligations on the other side. If Meridian terminates my involvement without notifying those parties, we're potentially looking at a material change that triggers review clauses in the Laurentian Agreement." I wasn't entirely certain about that last part, but the look that crossed between Celeste and the lawyer told me they weren't certain I was wrong. "We have a transition plan in place," the HR director said quickly. "Good. Who's taking over as primary relationship holder with the Infrastructure Ontario file?" Silence. "The transaction closes in 22 days, I said. "The financing syndicate's lead counsel knows me by name. The city's planning director has my mobile number. The Heritage Canada representative I've been working with for 14 months is expecting a call from me this week about the final design compliance report." I paused. Whoever's handling the transition should probably know those things. Celeste's jaw tightened slightly. She was smart enough to understand the implications. Her son-in-law, sitting in on these decisions from his strategic consultant perch, apparently had not fully briefed her on what the Laurentian closing actually required. "We believe the transition can be managed," the lawyer said. "I'm sure you do," I said pleasantly. I looked at the termination papers in front of the HR director. "Is there a cause cited? This is not a performance-related termination, so no documented cause, correct? This is purely a structural decision." I nodded slowly, picked up the pen. "Read through the termination agreement carefully. All 3 pages of it, standard language. No cause cited, no reference to the Laurentian transaction, no acknowledgement of the April 10th bonus vesting date that was 20 days away." I signed it, handed over my access card, said thank you for the opportunity, and walked out of that boardroom calmer than I'd felt in months. Because what Celeste didn't know, what her son-in-law definitely hadn't thought to check, was that they had just done the exact thing I'd specifically negotiated protection against. Instead of heading to the elevator, I went down 1 floor to the office of our general counsel. Her name was Beverly, not in the list, because she was actually a real person I trusted, and she was the one who'd helped me draft the language in Schedule C in the first place. She was originally from Halifax, had spent 20 years in corporate law, and had absolutely no patience for what she called executive theatre. I found her at her desk working through a stack of regulatory filings. She looked up when I knocked, took one look at my face and said, "They didn't." "April 10th is 23 days away," I said, sitting down and opening my contract to Schedule C. No documented cause, verbal confirmation in front of 3 witnesses. She read the clauses. "Read it again." Looked up at me with the expression of someone doing arithmetic that keeps coming out the same bad number. "Walter, the amendment language. Determining factor." They approved that language. Richard approved it. His signature is on page 16. She sat back. "If your involvement in Laurentian qualifies as the determining factor, and given the Heritage Canada file alone, I don't see how any reasonable person argues otherwise. You're looking at your full bonus plus 50%. Plus documented transaction costs, which I've been meticulous about tracking," I said. "Expense reports, mileage logs, hotel receipts from 18 Hamilton trips. Everything goes through finance." She was quiet for a moment. "There's something else. The Laurentian Partnership Agreement, the one between Meridian and the Hamilton Pension Consortium, has a key person provision. It names you specifically. If you're no longer with the firm, the consortium has the right to pause the financing pending review of the transition plan." I hadn't actually known about that specific clause. "How long of a pause?" "Up to 90 days. She paused. "Which would push the closing past the date when 2 of the pension fund managers need to have capital deployed for their fiscal year end. They'd likely withdraw. The weight of that landed in the room between us." "A $340 million deal," I said quietly. "Gone," she said. "Or at minimum, reset by 12 to 18 months while they rebuild the trust." She picked up the phone. "I need to get Morrison and Grant on the line. Right now." "I'd appreciate that," I said. "But Beverly, I want to give them 24 hours to figure out what they've done before this becomes a formal dispute. Let the math catch up to them." She nodded, already dialing. I drove home, made a pot of coffee, and called my wife. She was quiet while I explained what had happened. When I finished, she said, "Did you have the clause?" "I had the clause." Another pause. "Then they're going to call." She was right. By 2 in the afternoon, I had 4 missed calls. By 4, there were 6, plus an email from Celeste marked urgent. By 7 that evening, the consortium's legal team had apparently contacted Meridian directly, asking for written confirmation that the key person provision was being appropriately managed. I didn't return any calls that day. The next morning, I met for coffee with an old contact of mine, a senior director at one of the largest commercial real estate advisory firms in the country, based out of their Ottawa office. We'd known each other for 15 years. I'd referred 2 significant mandates his way over the years, and he'd done the same for me. In this business, that's not networking. That's the kind of relationship that actually means something. "Word travels," he said, wrapping both hands around his mug. "We were at a coffee shop near the Rideau Centre, the kind of place where half the conversations happening around you are about government contracts. 3 people called me about you yesterday afternoon. 3. What were they saying? That Meridian had done something very stupid and that you were suddenly available." He looked at me steadily. "The Pemberton Group has been trying to land a lead development director for their mixed-use portfolio for 8 months. They want someone who can work the municipal relationships in Ontario and Quebec. I've been quietly keeping them posted on the landscape." He paused. "I may have mentioned your name once or twice over the past year. The Pemberton Group," I said. "The pension fund consortium they work with." He smiled. "Includes 2 of the same funds in the Laurentian deal." The meeting with Meridian's legal team happened 3 days after my termination. I walked into Morrison and Grant's offices on Bay Street to find 8 people in the room. Celeste, her son-in-law, who for the first time since I'd met him looked genuinely uncertain. The HR director, Beverly. 4 lawyers, 2 of whom I didn't recognize. Celeste tried to open with a conciliatory tone. She said she thought there might have been some miscommunication, that the timing of the restructuring was unfortunate, that she valued my contributions. "The clause is clear," I said. "No miscommunication. You terminated me without documented cause within 60 days of a transaction closing where my direct involvement was the determining factor. The contract language covers exactly this situation." Mr. Finch, one of the outside lawyers, said, "Surely there's room for a reasonable negotiation here." "The negotiation happened 20 months ago," I said. "Your predecessor council negotiated this language with Meridian's previous leadership. It was agreed to and signed. I'm simply asking you to honor what the contract says." The son-in-law spoke up for the first time. "This is completely unreasonable. We can't just pay out a bonus for someone who was terminated before the transaction closed." I looked at him calmly. "You've been in the room for a lot of strategic discussions at Meridian. Were you in the room when I briefed the board on the Laurentian's status last November?" He paused. "Yes." "And when the board asked who was the primary relationship holder with Infrastructure Ontario and the Heritage Canada office, what did I say?" Another pause. "I believe you said you were," he said quietly. "I said I was, and the board recorded that in the minutes." I slid a copy of the November board minutes across the table. I'd requested them from the corporate secretary 2 days earlier, which makes it fairly straightforward to establish the determining factor question. Beverly pulled out a separate folder. "There's also the key person provision in the consortium agreement. The pension fund partners have already been in touch. They're requesting a written assurance from Meridian that transition protocols are being followed, which, as of today, they aren't, because there's no documented transition plan." One of the outside lawyers whispered something to Celeste. Her face shifted from controlled to something closer to strained. "What would it take to resolve this?" she asked. "Honor the contract, full bonus plus the 50% amendment, documented transaction expenses, and a reference letter confirming my role in the Laurentian transaction, which I'll need for future opportunities. And, if we don't, then the next conversation happens with the consortium's legal team, not mine. And then probably with Infrastructure Ontario's partnership office, since they have their own protocols about developer personnel changes on active government-supported projects." I waited a beat. I imagined the Laurentian closing becoming a public dispute would raise some questions about Meridian stability that wouldn't help you in any of your other active mandates. The room went very quiet. Meridian had 6 other active development files in various stages. 3 of them involved municipal partnerships. One was with the City of Mississauga and another with a provincially funded housing initiative under the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Losing credibility with institutional and government partners wasn't just a reputational problem. It was an existential one for a firm at Meridian's scale. "We need a few days," Celeste said. "You have 48 hours, I said. "That's the window before I'm obligated to respond to the consortium's inquiry myself." 14 days later, a wire transfer arrived for $1.2 million. The breakdown: $680,000 base bonus, $340,000 amendment provision, and $14,200 in documented transaction expenses. Along with it came a reference letter, one of the most straightforwardly positive professional references I'd ever seen, which I suspected Beverly had drafted herself, and a mutual non-disparagement agreement. They wouldn't say anything negative about me. I wouldn't discuss the circumstances publicly. Of course, the industry already knew. Within 2 weeks of my departure, the story that had circulated was accurate in its essentials, if not its details. Meridian had terminated their lead developer on the Laurentian file weeks before closing, without proper transition protocols, triggering a review by the consortium. The closing was delayed by 6 weeks, while a new primary contact was established, and the consortium's legal team satisfied themselves that the deal was still intact. It closed eventually. The fundamentals were too strong to collapse, but the delay cost Meridian the management fee structure they'd negotiated, because the pension fund managers renegotiated terms when the financing had to be reset. The son-in-law was quietly moved out of his strategic consultant role. Last I heard, he was working in an advisory capacity for a smaller firm doing residential development in the Fraser Valley. Good work for someone starting out, less suited to someone who believed he'd already mastered the business at 31. Celeste remained CEO, but the board brought in an independent COO to oversee active transaction management. The restructuring she'd been mandated to execute continued, just more carefully. As for me, I accepted the role with the Pemberton Group 4 weeks after my termination. Senior Vice President of Development, Ontario and Quebec. The salary was 35% higher than what I'd been earning. The equity participation in closed deals was structured generously, and the CEO, a man who'd spent 35 years building projects across this country, said something in our first real conversation that I wrote down and kept. He said, "The people who've been around long enough to know what can go wrong are worth more than the ones who've never had anything go wrong yet." My first mandate was a major mixed-use project in Gatineau, working across the Quebec-Ontario border, coordinating with both federal and provincial housing programs. Complex file. Multiple languages, heritage considerations. The kind of deal that requires exactly the sort of patient, relationship-based work that you can't replicate with a model or a methodology. I ran into my former Hamilton contact, the one who'd handled Heritage Canada negotiations on Laurentian, at an Urban Land Institute event in Toronto 8 months later. He'd left Meridian 2 months after me. They brought in a consultant to rebuild the relationship with Infrastructure Ontario, he told me. Government relations firm out of Ottawa. Do you know what that costs per month? I told him I had a general idea. More than what they thought they were saving by letting you go, he said. By a significant margin. That part I had suspected. When organizations make personnel decisions based purely on short-term cost calculations, they tend to miss the costs that don't show up in the same quarter. The relationship capital that evaporates. The institutional knowledge that walks out the door. The deals that quietly don't get renewed, not because of any single failure, but because the person who made the other party feel confident is no longer in the room. I've worked in this business for 30 years. I've watched firms that dominated their markets disappear in a decade because they confused efficiency with intelligence. I've watched people get passed over for people who were younger and cheaper and more impressive on paper, and I've watched what happens to the files those cheaper people inherited. Sometimes it's fine, sometimes it's not. The difference is usually whether the file had enough relationship equity built up to survive the transition. And that equity takes years to accumulate and about 30 seconds to damage. The clause in my contract didn't change any of that. It just meant that when they made that decision, I wasn't the one absorbing the cost of their mistake. My new contract at Pemberton has 4 pages of custom amendments. My lawyer helped me draft them. Every scenario I'd ever watched catch someone off guard. Timing of bonus vesting, key person provisions, notice requirements, client relationship continuity. We built protections for all of it. The CEO signed them without a single pushback. So, he said he'd been waiting 15 years for someone who actually read their contract before they signed it. After everything that happened, that might be the thing I'm most proud of. Not the settlement, not the new role, not the fact that the people who thought they were outsmarting me ended up spending more undoing the damage than they would have spent just doing the right thing in the first place. What I'm most proud of is that I'd thought about this possibility years before it happened, that I'd planned for it not out of cynicism, but out of clear-eyed experience. You spend enough time in any industry and you understand that institutions don't have loyalty, they have interests. The people inside them can be loyal, and many of them are, genuinely. But the institution itself will always prioritize its own survival. That's not a criticism, it's just the nature of how organizations work. Once you understand that, you stop being surprised when the priorities shift, and you start making sure your interests are protected in writing. Read your contract, understand what you negotiated and why. Know the difference between what you're promised verbally and what exists on paper. And if there's something that matters to you, a bonus vesting date, a key person provision, a notice requirement, make sure it's in the document, not just in someone's memory. Experience isn't just knowing how to do the work, it's knowing how the work gets taken away from you, and making sure you've accounted for that too.